Sunday used to feel different, not because of what was coming next, but because of what it meant. We didn't rush, we didn't scroll, we gathered. The television was already on. The sound of the game filled the room, even before kickoff. Someone was in the kitchen. Someone was already sitting too close to the screen. It wasn't just football, it was a weekly promise. In the 1970s, Sunday wasn't scheduled around life. Life was scheduled around Sunday, and the NFL quietly became part of who we were. The television wasn't just furniture. It wasn't something you decorated around. It was the center of the house. By late morning it was already on. Not blasting, not demanding attention. Just there, waiting. The screen flickered softly. The pre-game voices blended with the sound of dishes, footsteps, quiet conversations. Football didn't interrupt the day. It slowly became the day. We didn't sit alone. We sat together without planning it. Couches filled up fast. Someone always ended up on the floor, leaning against the coffee table. Someone claimed the best seat like it had been passed down to them. Moms moved between the kitchen and the living room, checking the oven, listening from a distance, never fully watching, but never missing a moment either. Dad settled in early. Once the game began, words became unnecessary. A nod, a sigh, a raised eyebrow said everything. And the kids, we learned the rules without knowing we were learning. We learned patience. We learned loyalty. We learned that Sundays meant staying. For a few hours, the outside world disappeared. No phones, no schedules, no distractions. Just a family, a game, and a feeling that everything was exactly where it belonged. Football didn't always belong in the living room. Before the screens, before the cameras, before the weekly schedules, the game lived somewhere else. But in the 1970s, something changed. The television didn't just show football. It brought it home. Suddenly, stadiums weren't far away. They were right there, behind the glass. We recognized voices before faces. Announcers became familiar, comforting. Their words guided our Sundays. Their tone told us when something mattered. The kickoff felt official. The theme music meant it was time, not just for the game, but for everything that came with it. The NFL understood something early on. If you could own Sunday afternoon, you could become a habit, and habits become traditions. Week after week, the league quietly took its place in American homes, not as noise, but as presence. You didn't choose your team. Not really. It was already there before you understood the rules, before you knew the players' names, before you even knew what winning meant. The colors were in the house, on a jacket, on a hat, sometimes just in the tone of someone's voice. Sundays taught us loyalty, not because our team always won, but because we stayed no matter what. Fathers explained the game in fragments. A sentence here, a gesture there, enough to make it feel important. And when the team lost, we didn't turn the TV off, we sat through it. Together, because this wasn't just about football. It was about belonging to something bigger than yourself. A team wasn't a choice. It was an inheritance. Football in the 1970s didn't apologize. It wasn't polished. It wasn't safe. And it wasn't quiet. The fields were rough. The uniforms were heavy. The hits sounded different back then. Deeper, louder, final. There were no slow-motion replays explaining everything. No endless analysis. What you saw was what you got. Players didn't smile much. They played through pain, through cold, through seasons that never seemed to end. Mud covered the jerseys. Snow buried the lines. Breath turned to steam in the air. And we watched every second of it. We didn't look away because this felt real. Defenses dominated. Quarterbacks got up slowly. Running backs disappeared into piles of bodies and somehow came out again. The crowd didn't sit quietly. They roared. They stood. They believed. This wasn't just a game being played. It was a statement. In those years, football mirrored America. Tough, confident, unapologetic. And on Sundays, we gathered around the television to witness that strength, to feel part of it, to believe in it, even if only for a few hours. Winter made Sundays slower. The cold stayed outside, pressing against the windows, while the inside of the house felt smaller, warmer, closer. Snow piled up on the sidewalks. Car engines struggled in the morning, but by the time kickoff came, none of that mattered anymore. Coats were hung by the door, boots lined up on the floor. The heater hummed steady and familiar. Inside, the couch became the best seat in the world. Blankets were pulled over knees, sleeves were rolled down. Hot coffee, soup, or cocoa was poured and refilled. The television glowed like a fireplace. Soft, constant, comforting. It didn't demand attention, it offered it. The sound of the game never stopped, even when no one was watching directly. It followed you into the kitchen, down the hallway, back to the couch again. Snow games felt different. Players moved slower, heavier. Cleats slipped. Breath rose into the air like smoke. The crowd sounded louder because of the cold, more alive, more desperate to be heard. And we watched, safe inside, warm under blankets, together without saying much. Those Sundays didn't need excitement. They didn't need drama. They needed time. Time that moved slower than the snow outside. Time that let you breathe. Time that asked nothing from you. For a few hours, you didn't have to go anywhere. You didn't have to be anything else. You were exactly where you belonged. Not everyone stayed home on Sundays. Some of us put on our jackets, brushed the snow off the car, and drove through quiet streets towards someplace familiar. The same bar, the same corner booth, the same faces week after week. You didn't need to call ahead. You didn't need an invitation. If the game was on, you belonged there. Doors opened early. The smell of beer and old wood filled the room. Televisions were already glowing, hanging in every corner. The sound wasn't perfect. Sometimes the commentary echoed. Sometimes you couldn't hear a word. But none of that mattered. Cheers rose together, sudden and loud. Groans followed just as fast. A bad call brought the whole room together. A touchdown erased every difference. Strangers became teammates. High fives were exchanged without names. For a few hours, everyone spoke the same language. Outside, the streets felt quieter than usual. Cars passed less often. The world slowed down. Inside, everything mattered. Across the country, in living rooms, basements, bars, and rec rooms, millions of people watched the same plays at the same moment. Different cities, different accents, different lives, one rhythm. The NFL did something rare. It connected neighborhoods, towns, entire regions, without anyone asking for it. On Sundays, America didn't feel so big. It felt close. It felt shared. And our hearts beat together. The 1970s were complicated years. The country wasn't perfect. It never had been. But there was a quiet confidence in the air. Not loud, not arrogant, just steady. A belief that problems could be faced head-on. That hard work still mattered. That effort wasn't wasted. Football carried that feeling. The NFL didn't try to soften itself. It didn't apologize for what it was. Strength mattered. Endurance mattered. Staying in the fight mattered. Teams didn't feel interchangeable. They had personalities. They had edges. Cities saw themselves in the way their teams played. On Sundays, the game became a mirror. We saw discipline. We saw struggle. We saw players get knocked down and slowly get back up. That image stayed with us. America was still finding its footing, still recovering from difficult years, still searching for balance. But when the game came on, there was certainty. The rules were clear. The clock kept moving. Every yard had to be earned. For a few hours each week, there was order. There was purpose. There was belief. And when Sunday ended, when the television went dark, that feeling didn't disappear. We carried it into the week ahead. Sunday didn't end with noise. It didn't end with shouting or celebration. It ended quietly. The final whistle blew, but no one moved right away. The television stayed on. The commentators kept talking. Replays rolled. Slow motion hits. Missed chances. Moments that felt bigger now that they were over. Someone leaned back on the couch. Someone else rubbed their eyes. A child lay on the floor, still half listening. The room felt full and empty at the same time. Plates were pushed aside, napkins crumpled. Empty glasses stayed where they were. Outside, the light had changed without anyone noticing. The sun was lower now. The day was slipping away. We talked about the game, because it was easier than talking about what came next. That call should have gone the other way. That catch should have been made. Next week would be different. Wins stayed with you. Losses followed you. You carried them into Monday morning conversations, into break rooms, into classrooms. Sunday afternoon belonged to football. Sunday night belonged to reflection. Kids started thinking about homework they hadn't done. Adults thought about alarms, commutes, responsibilities. The ritual was ending, but something lingered. A feeling of shared time, shared silence, shared attention. For a few hours the world had slowed down, and now it was speeding up again. Monday was coming. It always did, but Sunday had already done its work. There was a time when the Super Bowl wasn't an event. It wasn't a spectacle. It wasn't a global stage. It wasn't surrounded by weeks of hype. It was just the biggest game. In the 1970s, the Super Bowl didn't belong to advertisers. It didn't belong to pop stars. It belonged to football. People didn't talk about commercials the next day. They talked about plays, about decisions, about moments that could have gone another way. You didn't plan parties months in advance. You didn't need themes. You didn't need decorations. You needed a television. You needed food. And you needed people. Living rooms filled slowly, not all at once. Someone arrived early. Someone showed up late. Coats were tossed aside. Chairs were pulled closer. Kids were told where they could sit and where they couldn't. The game demanded attention. This wasn't background noise. This wasn't something playing while you talked about other things. When kickoff came, conversations softened. Eyes turned forward. The room leaned in. The Super Bowl felt heavier than a regular Sunday. Not louder, heavier. You could feel it in the pauses, in the way people watched, in the way no one wanted to miss a single play. For the players, this was the peak. No guarantees of tomorrow, no safety nets. For the audience, it felt earned. 2 teams, 1 game, everything on the line. And when it was over, there were no fireworks, just silence, exhaled breath, a sense that something final had happened. It stayed with you. After the biggest games were over, after the noise faded, something else remained. Not excitement, not adrenaline, memory. The 1970s didn't rush past people. Life moved slower. Moments had room to settle. Football wasn't something you consumed and forgot. It stayed with you. You replayed moments in your head while washing dishes, while driving, while lying awake longer than you should have. There was time to think. You remembered the way the room felt, the way the couch dipped under familiar weight, the way everyone leaned forward at the same moment. Those details mattered, because football wasn't separated from life. It was woven into it. You didn't check scores instantly. You waited. You listened to the radio. You read the paper the next morning. And when you talked about the game, you didn't rush through it. You explained it. You defended your team. You argued gently. Sometimes not so gently, but always with care. The NFL didn't fill every moment. That's why the moments it filled felt important. Sundays gave shape to the week. They marked time. And when everything slowed down, when the house grew quiet again, football became a place to return to, not a thing to scroll past. That's what made it last. Before the NFL became louder, before it became faster, before it learned how to sell itself, it spoke quietly, and people listened. In the 1970s, the voices calling football games didn't feel distant. They didn't sound like they were performing. They sounded like they were with you. They entered the living room without knocking, and somehow, they never overstayed their welcome. These voices didn't dominate the game. They respected it. They knew when to talk, and more importantly, they knew when not to. That balance mattered more than anyone realized at the time. You didn't need to look at the screen to know who was speaking. You recognized them instantly, by rhythm, by restraint, by tone. They weren't there to convince you of anything. They didn't chase excitement. They trusted the moment, and that trust carried through the room. There was no rush to fill every second. If a play unfolded slowly, they let it breathe. If the crowd noise swelled, they stepped back. If something important happened, they didn't raise their voice. They lowered it. That's how you knew it mattered. Those voices weren't trying to be remembered, and that's exactly why they were. They didn't compete with the game. They framed it. They helped you see what you might have missed without telling you what to feel about it. And that distinction mattered because emotion wasn't delivered. It was discovered. In those living rooms, sound carried weight. The crack of pads, the echo of a whistle, the low rumble of a crowd. The announcer didn't rush in to explain it away. Sometimes there was silence, real silence, and no one was uncomfortable. Silence back then wasn't a mistake. It was permission. Permission to lean forward, permission to absorb, permission to feel without being told how. Today, silence feels risky. Back then, silence felt confident. Those voices didn't belong to networks. They belonged to Sundays. They belonged to routine, to familiarity, to repetition. You heard them week after week, season after season, and slowly, without effort, they became part of your memory of that time. Years later, people don't always remember the score, but they remember the sound. They remember the cadence, the pauses, the calm. They remember how the room felt when those voices filled it. Because those voices didn't just describe football, they accompanied it. And in doing so, they accompanied us. When people talk about missing how football used to feel, they're not just talking about rules or uniforms. They're talking about atmosphere, about restraint, about trust, about space. They're talking about voices that didn't shout and moments that didn't need help being meaningful. Those voices taught us something without trying to, that not everything needs to be louder to be stronger, that not every moment needs commentary, that sometimes the best thing you can do is step back and let the moment speak for itself. That's how those Sundays stayed with us, not because they demanded attention, but because they respected it. Time didn't feel empty in the 1970s. It felt wide. There was room inside it. Nothing rushed to the next thing. Nothing competed for attention every second. And football, especially the NFL, understood that rhythm. Games weren't slow, but they weren't anxious either. They unfolded. You didn't feel pulled forward by what was coming next. You stayed where you were, in the moment. Sunday afternoons didn't feel like something you had to get through. They felt like a place you could remain. Kickoff didn't arrive with hype. It arrived on schedule. You knew when it was coming. You didn't check your watch every 5 minutes. Time felt dependable. And because of that, you trusted it. Commercial breaks didn't break anything. They were pauses, not interruptions. You stood up. You stretched. You walked into the kitchen. You didn't panic about missing something important, because important things didn't disappear instantly. They waited for you. Halftime wasn't a spectacle. It didn't try to impress you. It gave you space. Space to talk. Space to argue. Space to sit quietly if you wanted. The game respected your attention. It didn't try to steal it. You could feel the structure of a game. Beginning, middle, end. And that structure mattered more than we realized at the time. Because life felt structured too. There were days. There were weeks. There were rhythms you could rely on. Football didn't fight against that. It fit into it. You didn't consume a game. You experienced it. It stayed in one place. In one afternoon. It didn't follow you afterward. And because it didn't follow you, you returned to it willingly. When a game ended, it ended. There wasn't a need to keep reliving it instantly. You let it settle. You let it become memory. Waiting was part of the design. Waiting for the next drive. Waiting for the next Sunday. Waiting for the standings in the paper. And waiting gave weight to what you were waiting for. Nothing needed to shout to prove its importance. The clock moved. The game progressed. You trusted it. That trust is rare now. Back then, time didn't feel like something to manage. It felt like something to inhabit, and football was one of the places where time made sense. People didn't talk about content. They talked about afternoons, about moments, about how something felt while it was happening. That's why those games stayed with us, not because they were faster, not because they were bigger, but because they respected time, and time respected them back. When people say things used to feel simpler, this is often what they mean. Not less meaningful, not smaller, just slower enough to be remembered. The NFL didn't rush past us in those years. It walked beside us, one Sunday at a time. Waiting used to be part of life, not the frustrating kind, not the anxious kind, the patient kind, the kind that gave things weight. In the 1970s, nothing arrived instantly, and because of that, almost everything mattered more. Football understood this instinctively. You didn't wake up on Sunday and immediately feel satisfied. The day stretched ahead of you. Kickoff was coming, but it wasn't here yet, and that gap mattered. You waited all week, not just for the game, but for the feeling that came with it. Monday felt far away from Sunday. Tuesday even more so. By Wednesday, anticipation began to settle in. You didn't refresh anything. You didn't scroll. You carried the waiting with you. You talked about last week's game because there was time to talk about it. There was no next distraction pulling you away. Arguments lingered. Opinions hardened. Memories reshaped themselves. Waiting allowed stories to grow. Sunday morning wasn't rushed. You knew where the day was headed, but you didn't sprint toward it. Breakfast happened. Chores happened. Time moved forward calmly, and somewhere underneath it all, you felt it. Today was football. Waiting taught you patience with the game itself. You waited for drives to develop. You waited for plays to unfold. Not everything happened in a flash. A run gained 3 yards, a pass fell incomplete, and you accepted it because you trusted what was coming next. You waited for scores if your team wasn't on television. You listened to the radio. You imagined the field. You pictured the play. Your mind did half the work, and because of that, the game felt personal. You waited until the next morning to see the standings. You opened the paper slowly. You found the sports section. There it was, printed, final, unchanging. Waiting gave closure. Today, waiting feels uncomfortable. Back then, it felt natural, because life itself moved at that pace. You didn't demand answers immediately. You let them arrive. Waiting made victories sweeter. You carried them with you. Waiting made losses heavier too. You had time to sit with them, but that wait meant something. It meant you cared. The NFL didn't try to eliminate waiting. It relied on it. Weekly games, season-long arcs. Nothing was instant. Everything was earned. That's why memories from those years feel solid. They weren't overwritten immediately. They had time to settle. Waiting gave them roots. When people say they miss how football used to feel, they're often missing waiting itself. The space between moments, the anticipation, the quiet confidence that something was coming and that it was worth waiting for. Waiting taught us something deeper, that not everything needs to arrive right now, that meaning grows in absence, that patience sharpens attention. Football didn't hurry us, it asked us to stay, to watch, to wait, to trust. And when Sunday finally arrived, it felt earned, because waiting had prepared us for it. There was a time when football stayed in its place. It didn't chase you, it didn't interrupt you, it didn't ask for you every hour of the day. It waited, and because it waited, it felt important. In the 1970s, the NFL didn't live in your pocket. It didn't vibrate. It didn't flash. It didn't remind you of itself constantly. You had to go to it, and that changed everything. Football existed in specific spaces, in the living room, on the radio, in the newspaper. You entered those spaces willingly. When you turned on the television, you were making a choice. When you tuned the radio dial, you were leaning in. When you unfolded the paper, you were committing time. Nothing was automatic. And because nothing was automatic, everything felt intentional. When the game ended, football stayed behind. It didn't follow you into dinner conversations unless you invited it. It didn't sit beside you at work. It didn't fill every quiet moment. It respected the boundary between moments, and those boundaries mattered. Life had texture back then. There were parts of the day that belonged to other things. Family, work, silence, routine. Football didn't compete with them. It lived alongside them. That balance gave it weight. You didn't know every detail about every team, and you didn't need to. Mystery was part of the experience. You filled in the gaps yourself. You imagined what you didn't see. You talked through what you missed. You remembered what mattered most to you. Football met you halfway. Because it wasn't everywhere. It stayed special. Because it wasn't constant. It stayed powerful. Because it didn't demand attention. It earned it. When Sunday came, you were ready, not because you had been saturated with content, but because you had been away from it. Absence sharpened focus. Distance deepened feeling. You stepped into football, and when it was over, you stepped back out. That movement mattered. It allowed the game to settle. It allowed emotion to rest. It allowed memory to form. Today, everything follows us. There is no edge between moments, no pause, no silence. Football is always there, and because of that, it's easier to ignore. Back then, football knew when to leave you alone, and that restraint made it stronger. It trusted that you would return, and you always did. The NFL didn't try to be your entire day. It aimed to be part of your life, a meaningful part, a remembered part. That's why those Sundays feel larger now, not because they were louder, not because they were bigger, but because they were contained. They had shape, they had limits, and within those limits, they mattered deeply. This wasn't just about football. It was about how life felt, when things stayed where they belonged, when attention wasn't fractured, when meaning wasn't diluted. Football taught us something without trying to. That presence is stronger than persistence. That rarity creates value. That silence protects memory. And maybe that's what we're really remembering. Not just the NFL, not just the games, but a time when things didn't chase us, when we went to them instead. Some things didn't used to be rushed. There were moments you stopped for, moments you stayed inside of, moments you didn't feel the need to fill. In the 1970s, life didn't pile up the way it does now. Not everything happened at once. There was less noise, but more meaning. And Sundays moved at a different pace. The morning might have started like any other morning, but everyone knew deep down, today was different. As the hours passed, the feeling in the house began to shift. Conversations changed tone. Time slowed down. The NFL wasn't just something on TV. It was never background noise. It was a pause built into the week. People weren't just watching a game. They were sitting together. They were sharing silence. They were sharing attention. And without realizing it, they were building something they would remember. Televisions were bigger. Pictures were softer, sometimes a little blurry. But no one complained. Because clarity wasn't in the image. It was in the feeling. Everyone knew where they sat. That seat wasn't negotiable. That chair belonged to someone. Kids sat on the floor. Adults leaned back just enough. And when the ball was snapped, everyone leaned forward. A pass in the air. A hard hit. A call from the referee. The room reacted as one. That kind of rhythm doesn't happen by accident. It comes from shared time. The NFL back then didn't shine the way it does now, but it carried weight. Everything moved a little slower, but everything felt solid. Players weren't as famous, but the way they played reflected where they came from. Pittsburgh played tough. Dallas played confident. Oakland played defiant. Green Bay played stubborn. Teams felt like cities. Cities felt like people. And people saw themselves on that field. Wins felt personal. Losses hurt deeply. Either way, a connection was formed. When the game ended, no one jumped up right away. The TV stayed on. The commentators kept talking. There was no rush. There was nowhere else to be. The moment wasn't over yet. That's when the talking started. He should have thrown it there. That defense broke down. Next week will be different. Those conversations weren't just about football. They were a way of processing life, of taking something that happened and making sense of it together. The 1970s made room for remembering. Things weren't instantly replaced. Nothing disappeared right away. A single game could stay with you for weeks. A single moment could linger, because there was space between things. There was silence, and silence gives memory room to grow. Today, everything is sharper, faster, brighter, but maybe that's why so much of it slips away. Back then, the NFL lived inside life. It didn't sit on top of it. There was Sunday. Then Monday came, and Sunday came with you into Monday. In a feeling, in a conversation, in a quiet thought. Maybe that's what people miss. Not just the games, not just the teams, not the scores. What's missed is being in the same room, looking at the same moment, sharing the same silence. The NFL taught something back then. Not everything has to be won, but everything should be experienced. Not every moment needs to shine, but every moment should be real, and real moments stay with you. We were there, maybe as kids, maybe as teenagers, maybe as parents, but we were there, and we remember the warmth of the room, the weight of a Sunday afternoon, the quiet that came after the game. We remember because those moments became part of who we are. This video wasn't made just to talk about the NFL. It was made for those who remember, and maybe for those who never got to experience it, to offer a small window into what it felt like. If this brought something back for you, if a line, an image, or even a silence took you somewhere you hadn't visited in years, this doesn't have to be the end of the journey. Liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications helps keep these stories going, quietly, without pressure, just like it used to be.